In the maritime history of the Northern Sounds, some tragedies are remembered not for their scale, but for their strangeness. On the night of November 12, 1966, the motor vessel Charon, a small car ferry, departed Port Gallows on its final run of the evening. It never reached the other side. 20-3 souls, including its veteran captain, Thomas Avery, were lost to the icy, black water. No wreckage was ever recovered. Every remote town has its ghost story, and Port Gallows was no exception. As a journalist chasing local folklore, I'd heard it all, but their legend was special. They called it the Charon's Toll. I was taking the last ferry of the night. Modern, sterile vessel cutting through the icy, black water of the Sound. The fog was so thick it felt like a living thing, muffling the world in a blanket of damp gray. The handful of other passengers were grim-faced locals, huddled in the warmth of the cabin. The story, as they told it, was about the original ferry on this route, the Charon, which went down in a sudden squall in '66. They said on nights like this, when the fog is a shroud, the Charon still tries to complete its final journey. If you hear a bronze bell ring, one old man had told me at the docks, his voice a low whisper, you pray you have something to pay the toll. I smiled and nodded, of course. It was great color for my article. I settled in for the crossing, the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engines a comforting, modern sound against the ancient, superstitious silence of the fog. I wasn't a believer. I was just a storyteller. An hour into the crossing, the unthinkable happened. The steady, comforting thrum of the engines sputtered and died. We were adrift. A heavy, unnatural silence fell, broken only by the lapping of water against the hull. The other passengers exchanged nervous glances. Then, a new sound began, faint at first, then growing clearer, carrying through the thick fog. It was a bell, not the sharp electric chime of a modern alarm, but the deep, resonant, mournful toll of heavy, old bronze. Ong, ong. It was a sound that felt ancient, a sound that vibrated not just in my ears, but deep in my chest. The air, already cold, plummeted. I could see my own breath misting in the cabin. The locals in the cabin weren't just nervous anymore. They were terrified. One woman began to quietly sob. The old man from the docks was gripping his seat, his knuckles white, his eyes screwed shut, as if trying to block out the sound. The tolling was getting closer. The story was no longer just a story. A shape began to resolve itself in the fog. A dark skeletal form gliding silently through the water beside us. It was a ship, an old rusted car ferry, its paint peeling, its windows dark and empty. On the bow, I could just make out the faded, ghostly letters, Ku-Cha-L-O-Owen. It was impossible. It moved without an engine, without a wake, a perfect silent specter on the black water. It was lit by a sickly, green, phosphorescent glow, the kind of light that belongs to the deep sea, too. Things that never see the sun. And on its bridge, I saw him. A tall, dark silhouette in a captain's hat, standing motionless at the helm. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't another vessel. This was it, the ghost ship. It had come for us. The bronze bell on its deck gave one final deafening toll that seemed to shake the very bones of our ferry, and then fell silent. The silence that followed was worse. A heavy wooden gangplank slammed down onto our deck from the Charon with a deafening crash. Then they began to cross over. The crew, they were the ghosts of the lost passengers, men and women in the simple, outdated clothes of the 1960s. They were pale, their skin having a bluish, waterlogged sheen. But the most horrifying part was the frost. A thick, crystalline layer of it covered their hair and clothes, and their movements were slow and stiff, as if they were frozen solid. They moved with a mournful, silent purpose, their empty eyes staring. Straight ahead, they didn't look at us. They simply began their duties. One started swabbing our clean deck with a spectral dripping mop. Another began polishing a railing, his frozen hand leaving a trail of ice in its wake. They weren't here to attack us. They were here to work. They were prisoners, an eternal crew, and their presence turned our modern ferry into a floating piece of their cold, watery hell. I was hiding in the main cabin, my back pressed against a wall, trying to make sense of the nightmare. The old man from the docks was huddled in a corner, his eyes wild with terror. "The bell has rung," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Now, the captain comes to collect the toll." He told me the rest of the legend, the part he'd left out at the docks. "The Charon doesn't want money," he rasped. "It's a cold ship, so cold. It wants warmth. Your warmth. Your life." He said that when the captain comes, you have to let him take it. A small piece of your body's heat. If you pay, they leave you be. But if you refuse, if you fight, he takes you. Not your life, he takes you. You become part of his frozen crew, forced to sail the fog for eternity, forever trying to work off a debt that can never be paid. As he spoke, the main doors to the cabin slid open with a slow, groaning creak. A figure stood silhouetted against the green glow. Of the ghost ship, the captain was here to make his collection. The captain moved with a slow, solemn grace. His uniform was drenched, his face a gaunt, waterlogged mask of eternal sorrow. He approached the sobbing woman first. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, its skin blue and wrinkled like a drowned man's, and gently placed 2 fingers on her forehead. The effect was immediate and horrifying. A visible, shimmering wave of heat, like the haze above a summer road, was pulled from her body and seemed to flow into his hand. She let out a soft, pained gasp. The frost on the captain's uniform seemed to melt slightly, and a faint, ghostly sigh of relief escaped his lips. He removed his hand, leaving 2 faint, frosty prints on her skin. The woman was left pale, shivering, and 10 years older, but she was alive. He moved to the next passenger, a burly truck driver, and did the same. This was the toll. A tax of life force, a sip of warmth to ward off the eternal cold of the grave. My journalistic skepticism had been replaced by pure animal terror. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let that thing touch me. I bolted from the cabin, running out onto the slick, open deck of the car bay. The air was freezing, the fog a solid wall. I scrambled into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking. I felt a moment of foolish relief, cocooned in my own small bubble of steel and glass. But then the windows began to frost over, not from the outside, but from the inside. Thick, crystalline patterns of ice spread across the windshield, sealing me in. The car's internal temperature plunged. The captain didn't need to open the door. The cold was his to command. I saw a shape form in the frost on my windshield, the faint, sorrowful face of Captain Thomas, his hollow eyes staring directly at. The ghostly whisper filled the car, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. All passengers must pay. As I sat there, trapped and freezing, I saw something slide from under the passenger seat, dislodged by my frantic entry. It was an old, leather-bound book, swollen with water damage. It must have been left behind by another folklore enthusiast. The cover read, Captain's Log, M.V. Charon. I opened it. The last entry was dated the night of the sinking. The ink was blurred, but legible. The storm came from nowhere, the captain had written. The rudder is gone. We are taking on water. The bell is ringing for abandoned ship, but the waves, they are mountains. I have failed my passengers. I have failed my crew. May God have mercy on our souls. The cold, it is the last thing I feel. I will go down with my ship, and I will not rest until every last soul is brought safely to shore. It wasn't a curse. It was a duty, a promise made by a dying man, twisted by tragedy into an eternal, horrifying burden. He wasn't a monster. He was a ferryman, still trying to complete his final run. I unlocked the door and stepped out of the car. I walked towards him, the captain, who stood waiting silently on the car deck. The other passengers had already paid and were huddled together, shivering. I was the last one. I looked into his hollow, sorrowful eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel terror. I felt a profound, heartbreaking pity. He raised his freezing, blue hand. I didn't flinch. I closed my eyes and accepted my toll. The cold was unlike anything I have ever felt. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was the feeling of life itself being siphoned away. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face from a childhood memory, and then I felt it go cold. I felt the heat of a fireplace on a winter's night, and then I felt it turn to ash. He took just a piece, a sliver of my life's warmth, and then he was done. He gave a slow, solemn nod of thanks, turned, and walked back towards the gangplank of his ghostly ship. The ghost crew followed their captain back onto the Charon. The gangplank retracted. The ghost ship slid silently back into the fog and vanished. A moment later, the engines of our own ferry sputtered back to life, and the warm cabin lights flickered on. We docked 20 minutes later, a group of pale, shivering survivors who stumbled onto the shore, forever bound by a secret no one would ever believe. The official report was a minor engine malfunction and a drop in barometric pressure. But I know the truth. I finished my article, but I told it as a story, a piece of folklore. How could I do anything else? But the toll was real. The captain's touch left its mark. I'm always cold now, no matter how many layers I wear, no matter how high I turn. The heat, there's a small, permanent piece of the deep, dark, freezing water inside me. A part of me that will forever belong to the last toll of the Charon bell.